Hello there and welcome back to the Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project. Now back in the slightly distant past when I was working on the copper metallic corset for Arcana, I mentioned in that video that I wanted to modify that pattern a little bit further or perhaps even try new corset patterns and make myself a new historic corset to wear for historical costuming. And while it has been several moons since then, I'm finally ready to get started on that project. And today I'll actually be making a mock-up corset with you all, although in the end it's a highly wearable mock-up that will go directly into my costuming closet/wardrobe. I wanted to modify my pattern a little bit for this. I wanted to try some new techniques and then actually try some new materials as well that I haven't used for corset making before. So I'm considering this a mock-up even if it did turn out rather finished in the end. But I'll show you exactly what I've been up to over on the blue patterning table of doom, as always. And because I just can't quit this pattern, I'm going to begin by tracing my original copy of this sized up pattern from Nora Waugh's Corsets and Crinolines. This is the pattern that I used to make my original late Victorian corset many years ago, and I've actually talked about that corset twice here on the channel before, so I will link both of those videos in cards here today. But essentially I just got very lucky with this pattern because once I printed this out, you can see there's a little scale underneath the corset pattern there. Once I printed this out with that matching 1 inch, this corset measured exactly 10 inches too small for me. The proportions, however, were exactly correct. So the waist measured to 20 inches and the bust measured to 30 inches, and I just needed to go ahead and add a ½ inch along each edge in order to size this up so that it would be a 30-inch waist and a 40-inch bust. Which is in some ways unfortunate because I don't have a lot of sizing information to convey to you all because I got very lucky with the proportions of this original corset pattern. But I'll begin today by tracing a fresh copy of this exact pattern that I used to make my black silk corset many years ago that all of my Victorian costumes are built on top of, so hopefully they'll still fit over the new version. I haven't actually tried that out yet because I'd be too sad if they did not. And then this red tracing that you see here that I'm laying over the original corset pattern, I'm laying this over the original historic pattern copy here. This is the modified version that I made for that copper corset for Arcana. Of course, I made a black version for that as well and covered it in beads because it did not fit perfectly. I modified it too far for the black version that time, and so now I have modified it back for that copper version, and I'm tracing that in red marker over the blue tracing that I made of the original pattern here to see what I had changed because it has been over a year now since I made that copper version, so I have no idea what I was up to back then, and I needed a refresher. Though actually I'm standing here wearing the copper corset from Arcana and deciding exactly what I want to try and change for this next mock-up. I'm going to shave a tiny bit off the waist of this, especially along the sides, and add a tiny bit along just the side seam. So between pieces 3 and 4 here, that aligns pretty well with the side of my body. So I wanted to add a little bit of extra hip flange, or a hip spring, I think they call it in corsetry, just along the side there. And I did go ahead and raise the front piece of this, the front neckline of my corset. This is a mid-bust corset. The 1880s version certainly lands about mid-bust on me, which is perfectly fine, but I thought I could eke out a little bit more height and get away with a little bit more height here. So I added on a ½ inch, sort of compromising between the original pattern and the almost overbust that I created for the copper version. And I did shorten the front a little bit, which is actually, in general, I want to do this again. So I want to, after making this mock-up version today, part of what I learned is that I want to raise the neckline yet another ½ inch and shorten the center front yet another ½ inch. So I added a little bit to the front here and took off a little bit at the hem of the front, but really I needed to go harder. But who knew, you know? That's why we make mock-ups. And I am still just refining this, making tiny changes. That's the thing about corsetry that's so different from my experience working with regular pattern drafting. In regular pattern drafting, I find that if you make changes this small, things that are under ¼ inch, it really doesn't make a huge difference to the finished dress because usually a lot of fabric is quite like malleable, and it, like, once your body warms it up, it sort of sits differently once you have it on. But when it comes to corsetry, that doesn't stretch at all. It's sort of made to be immalleable. So little small differences in the pattern actually make a huge difference in the finished garment. And I'm here refining exactly what changes I want to make in black Sharpie on my pattern. But I always recommend saving every version of a pattern if you go about changing it. Make a new tracing to make your changes on. That way you have all the different incarnations of that pattern, so if you need to backtrack, you can, because nothing worse than cutting a little bit off a pattern, losing that little snip, and then never being able to go back to the original version without starting over. That's always a huge bummer. But now that I have modified this pattern yet again, it's hard to explain exactly how. I added a tiny bit here, I took away a tiny bit there. I did that by looking at myself wearing the last version of this in the mirror and trying my best to see what I needed to do, you know? And here I am walking these seams to make sure everything is still the same length and matches up. And the front two pieces did need a little bit of a length trimmed off the end. I'll just label these so nothing gets confused. It's really easy with these sort of hourglass shaped pieces to forget which way is up and which way is left and right. So label, label, label. Not only your paper, but also the fabric in the end as well. But you can see I've really flared the hips. Compared to like the original corset tracing, I've flared the hips on this. I think I have a little bit more hip spring than the original corset was intended for. And I have taken a tiny bit more off the waist, just because, of course, I want to create as extreme of a silhouette as I can without being uncomfortable. Just for the fun of it, honestly, because why not try it? Now, this is a very strange color of fabric. It's blending right into the slightly gray-blue patterning table of doom, and that is because this fabric is a figured dotted silk taffeta from Silk Baron in a like almost navy blue, like a bright navy blue, and a muted gold, which of course reads as olive from many lights, but when it's laying flat like this, it almost just looks gray. It's a very strange, sludgy color of fabric. I actually, in the end, fell in love with it while working with it. When it was flat like this, I was like, okay, it's kind of dull. But once it starts to take on a 3D form, which of course it really shows off, it really turns quite iridescent, and so I ended up loving this fabric in the end. I had a yard of this in my stash because I had purchased it as like a sample that I was going to use for something else ages ago, and I didn't go with this color because, again, I didn't fall in love with it upon first sight. So I had a yard of this sitting in my stash, and the final corset I want to make out of this same type of dotted silk from Silk Baron. So I decided to use this for the mock-up so that I could use the exact same materials for the mock-up that I intend to use for the final corset. So the outside of my corset today will be this figured dotted silk from Silk Baron. I'll link this fabric below. But for the strength layer of this corset today, I'm using a material I have never sewn with before, and it did surprise me in several ways. This is cotton herringbone cotil that is actually made for corsetry. So I've only ever made corsets and stays out of cotton twill, like the stiffest cotton twill I ever had in stock at the time. But I've never bought purpose-built cotil fabric to make corsetry before because it's kind of on the expensive side. But I decided to go ahead and, thank you patrons, splurge and go for the real fabric to try and make a genuinely proper corset for once. And honestly, this fabric did surprise me. I have never felt a fabric. I mean, it seems silly to say it feels like canvas. It almost feels like a fabric made of stone. It's got a very unique drape to it in the sense that it has almost there's no flow or drape to it, honestly. Again, it feels like you're sewing with Formica or something. I don't know, it's very odd. It sews perfectly fine. It sews like a cotton twill. It does what you ask it to, but cutting it out and moving it around the sewing room, like I bought 2 yards of this, and moving it around felt like I was, again, moving around a very thin piece of stone or like thick aluminum foil or something. Very weird material, but it certainly does what it says on the tin. And with my leftover blue-green silk, here I did cut out some 2-inch wide bias tape, and then I took a scrap of the cotil and the silk to try and go ahead and set a busk in, because I've forgotten how. I hadn't done it in many years, so I went and tested that out here on my antique brass busk, and then I was testing out different colors of thread as well to see which color of thread I liked best on this. I didn't like navy or gold on this, so I ended up going with an olive green color of thread. That actually blended in best because the threads going one direction are blue, the threads going the other direction are like an ochre gold color. In the end, the whole thing mostly looks olive most of the time. And that's the color of thread in the end that blended best. Now, in addition to my actual corset pieces, I did need facings for both the front of this and the center back, so I cut those out as well. And these front facings I cut out of both the silk and the cotil, and they're about 2 inches wide. And I can go ahead and pin those onto the silk layer here. And then I'll grab my cotil layer and pin those like so. So right sides together, basically. That's what's happening here, which won't exactly be what happens for the rest of this. I'll go into that later. But I'll pin these along the center front, making sure to line everything up extra precisely for this project, because again, a little bit of wiggle makes a huge difference in the finished garment. And when stitching this closed along the center front, of course I need to leave gaps for the hooks of my busk. The hooks of the busk always go on the right-hand side, and the pins of the busk on the left-hand side of the front here. But I just need to go ahead and trace in where these are going to fall along the center front line. That way I can only sew in between them, and I'll just sew quick little sections and skip the middles. I'm actually going to put an X in colored pencil on those, so I remember not to sew them. And even pinning this fabric was unique. Pinning cotil. I think you have to have very sharp and very strong pins, which none of my pins are new right now, so that was a bit of a struggle. But for this other side here, I can just, again, pin right sides together with my front facing, and then I can just sew a 1/2 inch away from the edge. And because the pins are going to get poked through the fabric using an awl later. I don't have to do anything funky with this, it's just a straight line that I sew down the center front. I was really glad I ended up picking up an antique brass colored busk for this because it matched my olive sludgy fabric so very well. And hopefully you'll see what I like about it in the end. As we continue to sew here, you'll see this fabric really does glow olive green, and we all know I love every shade of green. So it's no surprise I ended up really liking this garment. But here I am, sewing in between my X's, backstitching at the start and end of each of those, for extra security of course. Although in single layer corsets, I think sometimes these are just slit, like the fabric is just cut along the fold, and then the hooks are put through. That would be like the budget corset version. And most corsets were mass-produced, especially at the end of the 19th century, when this corset pattern would have been from. Although I'm not sure if this corset was a mass-produced corset or a custom corset made for a certain client. I don't have any more information on this. I don't even actually own the book Corsets and Crinolines. This pattern is just floating around over on Pinterest, and of course I will have it linked below for you. So you too can just print it out, size it up using that 1-inch guide, and measure it and see how you compare. And of course you can just redraw and add ease on wherever you want. It's just a guideline, you know? Most historic patterns, there's a lot of, especially clothes, you can get away with really making them your own, because you have to imagine that, say, like I live in what would be rural Colorado at the time, certainly the Wild West, and if, you know, someone got a Sears catalog, a delineator, back in the late 1880s, early 1890s, and they were not wealthy and didn't have a dressmaker, they would have to make a go of it on their own. So you have to imagine, if they were going to have to wing it, it's okay that you have to wing it. You know what I mean? That's what I always think about historic costuming. I'm not too precious about it. But once I have my seam pressed open and then pressed back, folded inside, I can slip my busk in here and it fits quite nicely. I am stitching with a size 14 Microtex needle. Microtex means extra sharp as far as I'm concerned, and that's good for the silk. And then the 14 is for heavyweight fabrics, which is what the cotil would definitely qualify for. It's the heaviest fabric I've ever used, other than like a coating wool, for sure. And I have switched over to my zipper foot so I can stitch real close and stitch right down next to the hook side of the bust now that it is in place. I do have that pinned, so I'm trying to remember to remove those pins as I go. And I think at this point I am wearing safety goggles while I do this, because if I hit the busk, that needle's going to break, and who knows where it will fly off to. So anytime I'm sewing near steel, I do try and put my safety goggles on, which is a really cute look for me, especially because they're very dusty and scratched and unattractive safety goggles. If anyone wants to link me to some super excellent steampunk sort of safety goggles for having next to the machine, feel free to let me know about any. Seems like it would be a more fun situation. Although I wouldn't want like plasticky ones. I would want like real ones, because of course I'm pedantic that way. But the hook side of my busk is into the front of my corset. Woohoo! I was kind of dreading this. It's never as bad as I think it's going to be. Corsetry is actually quite fun. It feels almost more like engineering than sewing at some points. But as long as I take it slow, take my time, and go step by step. As my dad says, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. As long as I go one bite at a time, it's not so bad. But I went ahead and marked where my pins for my busk need to be by lining up the fronts and using a colored pencil to do so. And now I'm using an awl, and I eventually grab a knitting needle as well, because the awl was just not thick enough to open this hole in the fabrics big enough to slip the pin in. But you just use an awl. You don't want to punch this. You want to move the fibers aside. So I'm using an awl to press the fibers apart. Again, helping with that size 6, I believe, knitting needle. Maybe it's larger or smaller. It's been a long time since I knit anything, as previously discussed on this channel. But I poked all my holes in so I could place my busk into place, and then I'll give that another quick press, and again, pin close to that so I can, again, use my zipper foot to get my stitching real close to that steel, and again, put my safety goggles back on so that it looks like I'm in chemistry class, but really I'm just sewing my corset. And wouldn't you agree that this fabric actually comes alive once it starts going over a curve? It's got this olive green glow to it. It's kind of delicious. It's like an olive blue-green gray. And I think it's almost giving like Art Nouveau iridescence here. So that works quite well for a late 1880s, early into the 1990s corset. This is before corsetry switched to the S-bend. So this is much more of a, like the old style, as the Edwardians would call it, corset. This works for pre-1900. But that is where I spend most of my costuming time. I don't really love like the pigeon-breasted, fully turn-of-the-century stuff. I kind of prefer the 1890s and the 1880s. So for me, this corset silhouette probably is what works best. I would like to experiment with Edwardian corsets someday, but for now I'm sticking here in the 19th century. Alright, my busk is in on each side. I'll trim down my facings so that they're not extending past the rest of the corset. Let's go ahead and start assembling the rest of this. Alright, I'm going to grab the first side here, and I'm grabbing piece number 2. Again, be careful. Make sure you're sewing up is down and down is up and left is right, etc. Sometimes I draw it with chalk, as you'll see later, arrows onto the pieces, because better that than to get confused. Give this one last press. Try and line everything up, so again, I do not get confused. So this needs to be sewn to this. Right. Better to double check than to get it wrong. Now I'm going to use the sort of sandwich seamed method for this, which I've never used before, but you flip the right sides together for the silk, or the outer fabric, as it were. You don't have to use silk, of course. I'm being extra fancy today because I happen to have this in my stash. It's a very fancy selection for a mock-up indeed, but I'll go ahead and pin that seam in place. They're all kind of side seams. And then this gets flipped to the underside. So this coutil piece is going on the back. So it's sandwiching both layers of piece A in between the layers of piece B, if that makes any sense. Hopefully you know what I mean. To be fair, this is probably not the first corset construction video you've ever watched if you're here on the internet, because a lot of people will be making corsets out here. It's a very popular, or it was at least a very popular subgenre of YouTube for a while there. I kind of missed the boat, but that's okay. I'm never particularly trendy, I think, unfortunately. It would be much better for my quote-unquote career if I were. But I never make things at the exact moment when it would have been best. Hopefully people still want to see late Victorian corsetry. Yeah? Let's hope so. You're watching this video. You've made it this far. You're good to go. But once I have those 4 layers of fabric stitched together, I'm going to take that over here back to the ironing board and press everything into place. Kind of pressing each side individually and then together. And I'm using my tailor's ham a lot for working on this corset today, because there are such dramatic curves going on. Working on a curved surface is super useful, especially because my ironing board is a mistake. So it's much better to be working on the more solid surface of the pressing ham than my actual flimsy ironing board. I really need to get a nice ironing board in my next sewing room when that happens, because oof, I'm tired of using this IKEA one or Target or wherever it's from. It's not for, it's good for occasional ironing, not for someone who sews for their job, you know. So I did that first side, the pins side of my corset here, and I will go ahead and do the other side of my corset the same way. I was trying to batch process this as much as possible, although it's less so possible when doing this method. But here I am doing the right side as opposed to the left of my corset. Same idea, sandwiching that first piece, both layers of the first piece between the 2 layers of the second piece. And again, I'm using 1/2" seam allowance for all of this. That original corset pattern from Corsets and Crinolines, by the way, does not have seam allowance on it, so you'll have to add your seam allowance and then do any sizing or grading you need to do to it. Again, I'm no pattern grader. I have no idea, honestly, how to. I never had to take a class on it. Not my area of expertise. I always just take the pattern that is my size and modify something until it's the style I want. But with corsetry, I usually defer to historic patterns, which is what this is. And again, I just got super lucky with this pattern that the proportions were nearly spot on for me. So I just kind of hit the jackpot in that sense. But again, I'm using my tailor's ham to press over these hips in this corset pattern. Trying not to get puckering at this waist. I did get 1 pucker in this corset, which I will hopefully catch later and show you. And now at this point, I need to go ahead and top stitch that seam from the outside right next to the edge. We're going to create a boning channel along the seam using the seam allowance. So, I mean, I guess this isn't top stitching, it's edge stitching, but I'm stitching right along the edge of that seam through all of those layers, which is many layers. So it's a good thing this machine has a lot of horsepower and can go right through them like butter. And it's time for piece number 3. Again, you can see I have chalk markings this time to really make sure that I don't get this backwards, because I want, you know, left and right to stay consistent, because I don't want to sew the back of my corset onto the front and vice versa. Along the side seam, that might not be good. I mean, it's very similar to this piece, but I'm not taking any chances. And again, I'm sandwiching the rest of the corset in between piece 3 here. So I have the silk on the top, the cotil on the bottom, pin all along this curvy side seam, and again, stitch this into place. I'm sorry if my voice is getting extra gravelly here. This is actually the second voiceover I've done today because, as mentioned recently, I'm going to be out of the office once again for all of that good house hunting out of state, so very far away from the office, which has made my scheduled video plan for this month a joke, sadly. So I've had to throw out most of my ideas for this month because I've just been traveling too much, but you know, it will be worth it in the end if and when I find a new place to live. It's probably worth the hassle. However, I would like it to be as little change for you here on the channel as possible while I'm going through this madness, although the extra level of stress probably doesn't help my mental state when trying to get things done either, or record voiceovers like this and try and explain things. So again, I am made of spaghetti, but hopefully coherent enough to still be slightly entertaining. Even if you're watching me unravel, that could still be slightly entertaining, yes? But after I've top stitched these seams, I'm going to go ahead and run them back through in the opposite direction, stitching a little over 1/4 inch away from the first line of stitching, and this will create my boning channel along the seam line. And I did do this on a test piece to see exactly how far away from that stitching line I needed to go. It's somewhere in the liminal space between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch. The boning I'll be using is 1/4 inch wide, but of course all of these layers eat up some of the room, so it does actually need to be a slightly wider boning channel in order to fit that 1/4 inch boning. But I've done that for all of the seams I have sewn so far, and I can go ahead and sew the next panel on to the other side as well. Again, this becomes very repetitive and yet in a way soothing to do the same step over and over again and to triple check everything each time because of course the cost of doing it wrong is just too high. I suppose the good news is I'm about to see what upstate New York looks like in the fall proper, because the last time I was there, last month, because apparently I go every month now, the last time I was there, the trees were just starting to change and it was still like 82 degrees, but now it looks like it's 58 degrees and slightly rainy, and hopefully all the trees will be orange. So we'll see how it goes. I'll do a weather report while I'm there. A fall report from upstate New York. And look how curvy this buddy is. I've never exaggerated the curves on this corset quite this much, and the cotil stands on its own. Again, it's like sewing with aluminum foil in some ways. So it really holds the curve of the corset. You can see, again, it's a fabric made purpose-built for this purpose, and it does its job very well. I was a little bit worried though. Part of the reason I wanted to make this mock-up was I was worried when I finally used this pattern in a cotil and it had zero stretch to it, that the corset would be too small for me. So, I'll leave you in suspense to the end to see how this buddy fits. Unless, of course, you skip ahead or looked at the thumbnail. Which is, technically, I think, kind of cheating, okay? And I will go ahead and stitch on my last panel for either side of the corset. Again, just sandwiching the rest of the assembled corset between the two layers and then pressing them out into place, edge stitching the seam from the outside and then stitching the boning channel next to it. And you may notice, if you're watching exceedingly carefully, that the color of dark green or olive green thread that I'm using for this changes. And that's because I only had so much of the lighter olive green thread here in the sewing room. So whenever I was top stitching, I switched to a lighter olive thread, and whenever I was doing the stitching that wouldn't be seen, I was switching to a darker green thread. Again, adds a slight bit of complexity to this whole process. Now that I've finished assembling all my panels, I'm going to go ahead and finally finish this front panel facing edge. I just trimmed that a 1/2 inch so I didn't have the cotil in here, folded my silk over to cover that raw edge, and then pressed that into place. And I again will stitch this into a boning channel here at the center front along the busk, so I can have a 1/4 inch piece of boning next to my busk as well. helps strengthen this area. It is a good idea to buy your busks from reputable corset making sellers because like very cheap busks, perhaps on like, I don't know, Amazon, other various less quality than Amazon-ish websites, places on the internet, but you want your busk to be very sturdy. So you don't want a flimsy one. If you get a busk in the mail and it's very, very bendy, it's probably not sturdy enough for the intended use, especially if you're going to be in any way tight lacing. And this corset is the tightest waist of corset I've ever done. And this is actually the next day, and the night before I went ahead and finished one side of the corset completely so I could understand what I was going to be showing you for this next side. So I finished the left side last night, and now I'm going to go ahead and work on the right side with you. And the first thing I will do here is sew on my back facing. So this is my last center back panel, as it were. And I will pin the two layers together along the back so nothing moves around on me. And then I will pin on a good 3-inch wide facing back here. Again, this will get trimmed down quite a lot later, but just start with this. This is all cut on the straight grain, by the way. I didn't mention that. I don't know if you cut coattail on the bias, if it stretches at all. I haven't tried to pull it, but I don't think it stretches much, even on the bias. But you don't want your corset to stretch. That's kind of the point of a corset, is that it does not stretch. The corset molds your body. Your body does not mold the corset, if that makes any sense. But I'll stitch that on over here on the machine, 1/2 inch seam allowance. And for this, I'm not doing the sandwich method. I just put right sides together here with both layers. And I will press that open as best I can, flip it to the inside. Actually trimmed a little bit of the seam allowance one side of the coattail here, just because I thought, how thick does this really need to be? And I pressed this coattail edge in a 1/2 inch to be able to trim this down along a straight edge. But then I referenced what I did the night before, and I had actually trimmed it even further. So I take off another 1/2 inch here or so. So I trimmed that down a good inch. I'm making it up as I go because it's just a little facing in here. That makes it so the back is nice and thick. You really want the back where the grommets go to be nice and thick, so the grommets have a lot to bite into. And to that end, I'm actually including a piece of cotton buckram in here. This is a cotton paper blend hat-making buckram, and I slipped an inch of that in here to help interface the back of this, and again, just add a little bit more meat for my grommets to eat into later. I saw a video here, I will link it below, actually in the description. I was watching someone make one of the Pretty Housemaids corsets, and they had suggested putting in a small strip of burlap back here to kind of pad this area out and to give the grommets something thicker to really bite into. But I didn't have any burlap on hand, and I figured buckram would work just as well. It's a little bit thinner and crispier, but it's better than nothing. So I threw a 1-inch wide strip of buckram along the back where the grommets would be in the end. So then I stitched the boning channel along the center back, and then I need to go ahead and leave that gap for said grommets. I made this 5/8 of an inch wide. I wish I had had the courage to only make this a 1/2 inch. That's another thing I learned while making this mock-up. The next time I will go ahead and just make this 1/2 inch. I've never ever had a good time setting grommets into a corset, so I tend to leave myself a little bit too much room. You really want the 2 pieces of boning either side of the grommets to help reinforce those grommets by being extra close. So honestly, because I was using tiny grommets, I should have made this channel a little bit closer to the first one. And from now on, you will see me referencing the first side I did quite a lot, but that's because it was like done late at night and I couldn't exactly remember what I was up to. But now I need to go ahead and take my boning casing tape, which is kind of like a twill tape that's woven into a tube as opposed to a flat piece. And I'm going to sew on my additional boning channels here. All the seam lines at this point between the panels have a boning channel in them, but I need to put on additional boning channels. You can see I'm using a disappearing ink pen to sketch these on. And if you look at the diagram from Corsets and Crinolines, it mostly shows a lot of these going either right next to or down the center of each of these panels. So I just took my ruler and found the center at the top, middle, and bottom and connected a line in between them to be able to find the center of my panels. Would it have been easier to do this when the pieces were flat? Yes! Should I have marked these boning channels and even maybe sewn the casing on before I put the corset together? Possibly yes. Maybe I'll try it that way next time. I don't know exactly, what is best practice because again, this is the most official corset I've ever made. It's been a while since I did a ton of corsetry. I used to do a lot more corsetry and stay making in the early days of my sewing. Of course, I started making vintage instead of historic costuming and therefore didn't require corsetry as much. But now I want to do both. That's right. But I've lined up my piece of boning casing along the center mark here for this back panel, and I'm stitching down one side right on the edge of this casing, and then again I've measured or done a sample to see how far away I need to stitch. Again, slightly larger than 1/4 of an inch, and I'll stitch down the other side that same way. Stitches the casing down to the coattail, which secures this casing down to the coattail. And I will actually stick the boning, instead of in the pocket of the casing itself, in between the 2 layers of casing and the coattail, which just felt like extra secure in there, I suppose. I will be using this spiraled steel boning for most of this corset today, except for when I didn't have the correct length, in which case I switched over to flat steels because I do have both floating around here in my sewing room, but not enough of either to do one or the other. So that was a bummer. I tend to use flat steels near the busk and along the center back, and then try and use spiral as much as possible everywhere else. And this panel actually along the back had 2 boning channels right next to one another. So I marked the center line, sewed one channel on the right side, one channel on the left side of that center mark. But again, yes, I was just looking at the reference of the pattern, the original pattern, and kind of trying guessing where those boning channels needed to be. It really looked like they were centered. Again, if you leave them exactly where they are, but you've made the pattern much larger, they will not be in their correct place for you. So this seemed to make proportional sense to me, that if they look like they were supposed to be in the center of the original panel, that I would put them in the center of mine. But I'm just going to make my way from back to front here, sewing on my extra boning channels, marking those down the center as need be. Again, referencing the original historic corset pattern to see exactly where these needed to go. If any of you are expert corset makers and have experience in this field, do let me know. Should I sew my boning casing on to the pieces before I assemble the corset? You can also put this casing along the outside, or like cover it in silk and then sew them along the outside as well. I'm putting them on the inside here, of course, because the fun glowy silk on the outside, I wouldn't want to mar that with black stripes. It would be quite fun still, but wasn't the look I was going for this particular item. You can see I'm scattering pins along like the wider areas of blank space in between the channels, and that's because I just want to make sure that fabric doesn't shift around too much while I'm sewing the channel down the middle. I want to make sure everything lays flat and aligned between the 2 layers, so that's why I have these random pins kind of scattered about. If you see those laying in there and are wondering what that nonsense is about, once again, I'm just making sure I center this, and instead of aligning it next to the center line for this, I truly am lining the boning casing directly along this center. So I'm finding the center line, and then I'll line up the boning casing centered along this line as well. Although I did just eyeball this. It should be fine, you know? One can only perfectly measure so much of things, you know, before patience is lost. And again, you can see how invaluable this tailor's ham is in this curvy garment in helping me to line things up as I go. Stitching that first side on, stitching the second, create my boning channel. And I only have one more piece to go. There's one more piece along the center front. So let's go ahead and mark that. Again, it's in the center of the bust up here. And then from the waist down, it really looks like this piece of boning follows the seam line here. So instead of directly marking the center, I followed the instructions of Corsets and Crinolines basically, and let the casing follow the seam from the waist down. Oh, my poor voice! She is so shot. I'm gonna need some hot tea or something in the morning. Luckily my flight isn't till late, so I have plenty of time tomorrow to pack, thank goodness, because I'm editing this video late here. I cannot bring my PC with me while I'm house hunting, and I cannot edit on my laptop. I think my laptop would explode. Half the time I boot up my laptop is from 2020, and half the time I boot that laptop up, it tells me a fan has failed, or it makes a beeping. The other day it actually booted up and told me it couldn't find a hard drive. And I was like, you're a laptop, you didn't lose it, you know? It didn't go anywhere overnight, so I think you should try again and see if you can find it. Found it. This is why I back up my writing, which is the only like document that's on that laptop really, all the time, because I don't trust cloud servers, but I also don't trust Dell, you know? So it's a risky game out there. But all my additional boning channels are sewn on, which means we get to bind the bottom of this corset, which is excellent news. The binding on a corset is so nice. I'm scarred from all the stay making in my youth because binding tabs is a nightmare, but binding the top and bottom of a corset, not a problem at all. So I've grabbed my 2-inch wide bias tape here. I'll go ahead and pin that along the bottom edge. You saw I just trimmed off any excess fluff or bits that were sticking out. Of course, I was pinning the wrong side of the silk on. Silly me. There we go. Right sides together, kid. Thank you. And currently the only boning in the corset is still just the busk along the center front, so I have to be extra careful around there, but otherwise I'm not going to hit any steel, so no problem there. And for once, while making a corset, I actually put the correct lengths of boning in these channels. I tend to put boning that's too long in the channels. It's better if it has a little bit of wiggle room lengthwise, and then you just do your flossing to hold the bones in place, which of course, this being a mock-up, I have not flossed it yet, but hopefully I will get round to it. I do need to floss my boning channels. Although, what color of thread shall I use on this? Probably a light olivey chartreuse. I should try and find silk thread so it's extra shiny and pretty. We'll see. But I've just pressed my binding smooth here, and then I will fold and press everything to the inside here, pin that into place, so that I can top stitch from the outside. If you wanted to stitch in the ditch, you could attempt to. I don't believe in stitching in the ditch. That just leads to mistakes in my world, so I'm going to edge stitch this on the other side, top stitch this into place, and that will catch this underside when I do so. I like to stitch from the outside and make it look intentional, because if I don't, it will come out looking very unintentional in the worst kind of way. But yes, I know I need to do my flossing. I also need to find lace for the top of this though, so in some ways this is not yet complete, but it's complete enough to try it on, which is what matters. And there I was just making sure that if I lined up the busk, before I stitched this binding on, if I lined up the busk, that the binding aligned with the first side I had done. I just wanted to make sure that if I could fudge it a little bit, fold it a little bit differently at the center front to make this align perfectly at the front if I needed to. So just playing with it a tiny bit to try and get the best possible result. And then here I have all my spiral and flat steels laid out. I sort of have a list of what I need for each channel, but I was kind of playing it by ear also while I was going along. I have a range from 13.5 to 10.5 inch bones here that I'm sticking in here. And once it gets too hard to put them into the channel, you can see I have a screwdriver here. And I'm just gently nudging them down into the channel, because some of these channels, although again, they're over 1/4 inch wide, they're still pretty taut around the edge of the bones in this thick cotil. So I was just gently urging them to sit where they're supposed to. And I try and make sure each bone is at least 3/4 inch away from the top. If I press them all the way down into the channel, I want to have at least 3/4 inch. That way I have a 1/2 inch for binding at the top, and then that 1/4 inch float for the bone that I can then use flossing to get into final position later. And once all my boning is in this case I used all steels. Again, a lot of people use synthetic whalebone. I don't like how thick synthetic whalebone is. Not the width, but the height of it. It feels like very tall to me for some reason, which is why I like how thin the steels feel. I don't know. Weird. Also, by using pre-cut lengths of steel like this, I don't have to finish the ends of the boning, and that just saves me one step that I don't want to have to do, But once all the steel is in, I can go ahead and, of course, bind the top edge as well with another piece of bias. Cut that to size, pin it in place. And again, because my boning is well clear of this area, I have no problem stitching this on. You could put your safety glasses back on, but I actually didn't bother because I like to live life on the edge. That's right. And again, press that up and smooth, and do the same finish that I did for the bottom of the corset up here at the top. Flip this to the inside, fold everything into place like so, and then again I will edge stitch from the outside to catch this inside edge. You could hand stitch this if you wanted to, although stitching through cotil by hand doesn't sound very fun to me, so better for patience levels to go ahead and just machine stitch it. And it is important to keep in mind when it comes to late Victorian corsetry that at this point the sewing machine has been around for a while, and a lot of corsets were being made in like a factory setting. So you don't have to feel bad about using your machine to sew a corset. That's very period correct to do so. And again, I'll just close my busk up to make sure the binding aligns at the top here before I stitch this into place. And I actually switched my pins to the outside so that I can stitch from the outside like so and pull them away as I go. Back over here on the machine. And again, I know this is inside from where the steel is, so I have no worry about running this through the machine. You could use the zipper foot for this too, if you wanted to get real close to the edge and not to the boning. But again, this was no trouble for me. You must do what you feel is right, of course, as Obi-Wan Kenobi would say. Now I'm going to go ahead and mark my grommets down the back. I put these 1.25 inches away. I've learned that I would rather have them 1 inch away. But again, I always make my grommets too far apart because I've always hated setting grommets. I have a grommet press, and I hate that thing. I don't know if it's the dye in it or if it's the grommets I was using, but it's never made consistent grommets that are not at least a little bit crunchy. And you don't want a crunchy grommet in your nice silk corset, so it wasn't about that life. So I grabbed a hand-set punch and die grommet setter from Tandy Leather, and I actually grabbed these grommets from Tandy Leather as well so that they would match the antique brass busk, and I gave these a try, and I actually pulled my mom has extra tiles from when they did their backsplash, so she had these travertine tiles that she made into coasters, so I actually stole a coaster from my mother, and I used that as the surface to hammer my grommets, and it worked perfectly. I've never had grommets set this well in my life. I did have to punch these as opposed to use the awl on them, which is a bummer because that is less structurally sound. You should technically use an awl to push aside the fibers to fit your grommets in as opposed to using the punch. But I had enough layers going on back here that the awl was not cutting it, so I had to use the punch in the end. So whether or not that will hold up, we will have to see. But I went ahead and did all of these grommets down the back, and then decided after trying this on that I needed a few extra right near the waist, so I put an extra 2 grommets on either side right here at the waist level, which does give me a little bit more support for the lacing. And you'll notice I did not put a waist tape in this corset. I've actually never put a waist tape in a corset. I put them in bodices all the time, but I've never put them in a corset. I don't actually wear mine enough that all this tension at the waist is going to be a problem because I wear my corset like 3 times a year, so I'm not super worried about it. But you can see where this is tensing along the waist, and so it'd probably be a good idea to put one in here. So feel free to give me waist tape encouragement. And here is my finished corset mock-up in this lovely blue, gold, olive green figured silk. Now you can see I have plenty of room here along the hips. Now this is either a good thing or a bad thing depending on what you're after. It does give me the illusion of even more hip spring than I have, and I could always put padding in here and give it a more Edwardian look. Also, if I sit down, this extra room does come in handy because then there's no extra room as soon as I sit down and things kind of move around a little bit. But I probably will take a 1/4 inch out between panels 2 and 3 for the next version, and you'll see how that fits when we come to making the final. Again, the fit on this corset is not absolutely 100% perfect, but I'm really happy with the finished garment regardless. I really hope I can find some olive green or some sort of metallic, sludgy, moss-colored lace to put at the top of this, but we'll have to see. I'll have to put all my material investigation powers to use for that, because to find something soft enough it won't bother me, and yet pretty enough to match this rather unique shade of fabric might be a little difficult. Again, this was just a mock-up corset, so I'll be making the final version with you soon, showing you all the little tiny tweaks that I want to make to this to make it hopefully even more perfect. And in any case, I hope you enjoyed seeing how this project came together today, and thank you as always for watching. And I also just wanted to say a special thank you to my patrons for making my work and projects like this possible. I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!